You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Over the last 10 years, Washington has passed a bevy of climate laws aimed at reducing the state's carbon emissions. That includes a carbon auction, a ban on coal in the state's energy mix, and a requirement that the state reach net zero emissions by 2045. But during that same period, energy production from renewable sources has actually declined slightly by about 4%. Oregon has set its sights on net zero emissions by 2050, and it, too, has seen sluggish growth in renewable energy. So what's going on in the Pacific Northwest? Both states rely on the Bonneville Power Administration to move energy. And a new investigation from Oregon Public Broadcasting and ProPublica's local reporting network found that BPA's aging grid may be stymieing decarbonization efforts in the Northwest. Monica Samayoa is a climate reporter at OPB, and Tony Schick is an investigative editor and reporter at OPB. Hi, Monica and Tony. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, Tony, I want to start with you. Oregon and Washington have these lofty goals to decarbonize over the next 20 years, but both states are struggling to make progress. We'll get into the reasons why in a moment, but first, can you just give us an overview of how Washington and Oregon are doing in meeting their energy goals, especially when compared to other states?
Yeah, they are pretty far off from their goals. Both states have added some renewable energy, but the graph of renewable energy growth in Oregon and Washington is pretty stagnant. In fact, if you are including traditional hydropower, it's gone down in Washington because there have been a little bit of drought recent years, which has diminished hydropower. And so Washington and Oregon, if you're looking at renewable generation growth in the United States, rank 50th and 47th, respectively, in the United States. And states that do not, necessarily pride themselves on these kind of things the way that Oregon and Washington do, states that don't have mandates, states like Texas, which is an oil and gas powerhouse, has seen by far the largest growth in the country of wind and solar energy over the past 10 years.
And we're going to talk a lot about the Bonneville Power Administration in this conversation. So let's just lay the groundwork first off. This is a unique federal agency that exists here in the Northwest. Tony, what is BPA and who's making decisions at the Bonneville Power Administration?
Yeah, BPA is what's called a federal power marketer. So it's a federal agency that's technically within the Department of Energy, but it was set up to run kind of like a business. It doesn't get any money from Congress. It's self-funded with the power that it sells from dams in the Pacific Northwest, dams on the Columbia River and the Snake River and the Willamette to a lesser extent in Oregon. It also, because of how energy development happened in the Northwest, dating back to the New Deal era, it owns like 75% of the transmission lines in the Northwest that carry power across the states and across the regions. There's not much that exists like it in that it is selling power from these dams and also owns a really outsized chunk of the Northwest transmission grid.
And who's making decisions at BPA?
Right. So BPA is a bureaucracy, an agency that is run by an administrator who is appointed. It does not have kind of a board or any elected representation. It really functions largely autonomously and is responsible for, making its own sound business decisions.
Yeah, which is really consequential when, as you say, such a large percentage of power lines are under its purview. And Tony, your reporting shows that BPA's transmission lines are this major hurdle to bringing new renewable projects online in Washington and Oregon. And the numbers are stark. Talk to me about how long the odds are for renewable projects to simply get hooked up to BPA's grid.
BPA's transmission lines are a hindrance largely because they are the largest grid operator in the Northwest. Something like 80% of all the megawatts, all the energy that is proposed trying to come online and plug into the grid 80% of it's trying to go through BPA, but these transmission lines are mostly full. And so it requires really costly upgrades to make it happen. And if those costly upgrades can't happen, developers just end up kind of sitting in limbo for their projects, sometimes for 5, 10 years, even more. Over the past 10 years, so since 2015, there have been more than 469 projects that have asked to connect to BPA's lines. And we found one wind or solar project that successfully made it through that queue.
That is so incredible. That jumped off the page for me when I was reading your story. And Monica, you spoke with people who develop renewable power sites about their experiences working with BPA. What did they tell you about hooking up to the regional grid?
Yeah, so we spoke with a Portland-based developer that basically told us the process desperately needs to be improved. So the particular solar project this developer wanted to create would have generated enough energy to power about 100,000 homes. They first proposed it in 2020, and that's when they asked permission to hook up to BPA's transmission lines. But every project needs to go through BPA's what they call an interconnection study. And that's a process the agency says all developers have to go through to basically determine if the project can hook up to their transmission lines or if they need to build a new power station. So this developer is still waiting to hear if they can connect or not. And it's been through 3 of these interconnection studies. They told us that they've been quoted more than 3 times the original price it would cost to build out a new power station or transmission lines to hook up to BPA. That amount was $212 million. So it's a very lengthy and costly process that usually ends up with developers dropping out either because it's taking too long or costs have increased more than they could afford. And the Portland-based developer doesn't expect to get approval from BPA until maybe 2028.
And Monica, what happens in the meantime? So they have this big solar array project. Does generally the project get built and then, later on you're trying to hook it up, or do the projects stall? I mean, what occurs when these developers are not able to get a connection with BPA?
In short, nothing. Because they need to ensure that they can hook up to the grid. And there's also other processes that they have to do, which includes siting. So they need to get those types of permits going, but they really can't do anything until they can know for sure that they can hook up to the transmission grid.
Wow. So it just grinds everything to a halt. What does Bonneville say about this time that it takes to connect to the grid, Monica?
Well, BPA says that they need to do these studies to weed out what they call speculative projects or projects that, let's say, for example, don't have the financial needs to get built. And, that's one of the reasons why there's a long approval time. But they did tell us that they've improved their process to look at projects that are shovel ready. So rather than in the order that they're being received, they're kind of going through that list and like, okay, this one's a little bit closer to what, we can get hooked onto quickly. And so BPA says that they hope that that process will cut that time in half to about 7 years rather than what Tony was saying, which was like about 15 years to get an approval.
Tony, Bonneville is this federal agency. As you said, it's kind of a uniquely set up agency. It does have the ability to borrow money at low interest rates to upgrade its infrastructure. In 2021, you report that Congress more than doubled Bonneville's debt limit so that it could upgrade transmission lines. This is where the choke point is. The upgrades are very expensive, but it didn't upgrade. I mean, why isn't Bonneville spending money in the way that it needs to be able to increase its capacity?
That's what a lot of people wanted to do, is just borrow more and spend more. And for its part, it has announced recently that it is planning to spend something like $5 billion on upgrades that people say are long overdue and much needed, if not enough. So the agency is spending some, but the reason it's not spending more, there's a few factors why. One, it can't borrow forever. So it has limits on how much it can borrow. It has a cap. And that is a little bit different from an investor-owned utility. It doesn't have, a congressional cap on how much it can borrow. So Bonneville says it has to be careful about that. It also has to be careful not to stick its existing customers with bills. Say somebody comes and says, a developer comes and says, I have this energy project that I want to build. And Bonneville says, okay, it's going to cost this much, to upgrade the lines, all these, millions, if not billions of dollars. Developer says, great, do it, plug me in. And then that electricity generator doesn't stay with their contract throughout the whole lifespan of that project. Say they bail out after 5 years or so.
They disappear. Yeah.
They disappear. Bonneville all of a sudden has to recoup that cost, but it's going to have to recoup that cost from its existing customers. And because so many of Bonneville's transmission lines are kind of like highways that the electricity kind of exits before it actually gets to its customer where it's going. Bonneville's not like a utility where it kind of is in control of like who pays like all of the customer load, like the amount of energy that the customers are using. That's kind of outside their purview a little bit. And so it's hard for that agency to make sure that they're able to plan the transmission lines and match them up with, okay, we know people are going to be able to pay for this and our existing customers aren't going to get stuck with it. And this is an agency that is financially very conservative, does not want to be carrying too much debt, has gotten into trouble with debt in the past because of, decisions decades ago to, pursue energy projects that didn't pan out. And so all of these are things that are kind of factoring into the decisions that it's making to either spend or often not spend or borrow money to upgrade transmission lines.
Monica, Tony just talked about the plans for Bonneville to spend, was it $5 billion, did you say, Tony? To build new infrastructure in the coming years. But there's another context that we have to kind of talk about, because Bonneville has also been the subject of DOGE cuts, staffing cuts. President Trump has also sort of been an antagonist for green energy projects. There's a lot of cuts in line for all kinds of renewable energy projects that were approved under the Biden administration. Trump has previously even floated privatizing the Bonneville Power Administration, which, local senators at least have fought tooth and nail to prevent. What kind of impact will, especially the DOGE cuts, have on the project of expanding capacity for transmission lines? Is that clear yet?
I mean, I think it's going to make things a lot more difficult, especially kind of what we're hearing in terms of funding and then just operating BPA. And we've heard from some BPA employees that have said that those federal cuts are going to make building transmission just that much more difficult. And that's still the case, even as the agency, we saw that they fired a bunch of people and then they're like, oh, no, let's bring some people back. They're still down hundreds of jobs because at one point there was hiring freezes, there was rescinded job offers, and then there was people that took the buyouts that were being offered. And those were the people that, it ranges from people that made policy to actual maintenance technicians that went out there to check on how the, transmission lines are doing. So the agency is going to be really stretched thin as it's trying to do more. And you're right. I think I would phrase it as the Trump administration attacking anything that has to do with climate action, climate policy. And, their focus is increasing fossil fuel use and then, continuing to sign executive orders that, not only at the federal level that have to do with climate action, but now we've seen that he's going to even go down to the state level of states that do have policies that have climate action or requirements of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's going to make it that much more difficult for, both Oregon and Washington to meet that law that requires electric utilities to be carbon neutral by 2040 or by mid-century, that much more difficult.
And Monica, before we go, I mean, both Washington and Oregon are recognizing that the Bonneville infrastructure is an issue. It's a hindrance to getting renewable energy online. Is there any alternative to go around Bonneville, find ways to, say, have the state legislatures fund infrastructure improvements? Not like there's a lot of extra money sloshing around in state legislative budgets these days, but, is there any political will there to fix this problem?
So there has been proposed legislation from both states that wanted to create this like a transmission authority that would help finance building out more transmission, but both of those bills failed to pass in each state. There was up until, this year, like, hey, maybe we should be looking at our transmission and we should do something about it. And it's devastating that these didn't move forward at a time where it's just like it's clear that something needs to happen. In Oregon, there was another bill that would have improved transmission lines by rewiring. And that would help really cut down costs a lot because it's not like placing new power lines. It's just kind of like giving them the little extra oomph for them to be able to handle some more capacity, some more power. And that bill is still being considered. But I do think that lawmakers are going to really have to start looking at what they need to do and what's in their power to get this process in a better state.
Tony Schick is an investigative editor and reporter at Oregon Public Broadcasting. Monica Samayoa is a climate reporter at OPB. And they both wrote, and if I may say so, infuriating but very illuminating story about Bonneville Power Administration and the goals of Washington and Oregon to go greener. That's in partnership with ProPublica's local reporting network. Thank you both for driving me absolutely up the wall, but also, again, informing us about something so important. Really appreciate you.
You weren't the only one.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.